This was originally going to be just a brief video about how to hook up an air horn in a bus that has an air brake system so you've got air. That was a request. I mentioned putting an air horn in Victoria, the old vintage cab-over engine Ford truck that's become our little farm truck daily driver. But I can't really talk about how to put an air horn in without addressing how to do it safely. And if you're tying into the air brake system, you've got to do that in a way where you don't create a hazard or make your air brake system less safe. So it morphed into how to do that properly. And if I'm going to talk about how to tie into the air brake system, especially if you are a new school bus owner or bus owner, it makes sense to explain how an air brake works. So anyway, this video expanded a bit. I'm going to talk about air brakes, primary and secondary systems, how to tie into them properly, how to use or make sure you tie into the part that has a pressure protection valve. Talk about some accessories you can add to your system and how the air brakes work with the parking brake and the service brake. We put air horns on Victoria, the vintage cab-over engine Ford truck. And somebody asked me to do a little video about that. So in this particular one, I will show you separately where we tied in. This is the incoming pressure line, and that's tied into part of the air system that is protected by a pressure protection valve. I've got one of those and I will show you what it looks like. I'm going to do a little demo. But in the meantime, before I cover this up, I want to show you what we did. So I wanted a pull chain in this one, kind of classic vintage. So I put a pull chain and a manual valve here. So this is pressure coming in, and then this is the outgoing that goes to a splitter. One line, this is 1/4-inch tube, comes up here to the air horn on the driver's side. The other one goes over to the air horn on the passenger side. So before I insulate this and close it up, I wanted to show you. There are other manual valves, and I do like manual valves. I mentioned, or at least should clarify, that there are really four kinds of air horn valves that I am aware of. One is an electric button that sometimes will be activated by a little foot switch. We have two ambulances with little foot pedal. They're electric switches, and when you push on that switch, it closes a circuit, sends power to a solenoid, which is just an electric valve. And with those kinds of things, the air horn is either on or off. Then there are some which are like a turn valve, almost like a 1/4 turn ball valve. And I think those are pretty common with some of the truckers. They're on sort of a U-shaped bracket, so they sit up on the floor. I didn't want that. I put in the very kind of traditional pull chain in this. I think it's sort of cool, and it gives you some control. So I can do that for a full pull or full air horn, or I can do little toot toot pretty quickly. It gives me a little bit of control, and I think that's sort of fun. And then there is the other valve that I will show you in this video. This is a different one that is a floor-mounted valve, so you just press on it, and on this particular one, the incoming air pressure comes in on the bottom and tends to hold the valve closed, so when you push on it with your foot, then air can come out here to your air horns. And I've got those in a couple buses, and they're nice, but on this truck, just in keeping with the vintage cool theme, I wanted a pull chain. So when you are thinking about adding an air hose or a chuck so you can run any kind of air tools, or maybe, inflate tires out on the road, that kind of stuff, or if you want to add an air horn or something, you want to identify the auxiliary tank, and you're going to have several air tanks under your bus. You may have two, you may have three. One will be a primary tank for typically rear brakes are the primary, And then you'll have a secondary air tank, which will be for the front brakes typically, and then an auxiliary tank, which is separated from the primary and secondaries by the pressure protection valve. Now, you got to figure out which is which. An easy way to do that is to trace back lines to an airbag or something. Now you may have two tanks, like here I'm laying under a tank, and then here is a second tank. Do keep in mind they all have drain valves, and you got to make sure that you purge any water or oil contamination that might be in those. But anyway, the primary and secondary brake tanks are not pressure protected. And so you don't want to just tap into those, because if you tapped into this line and then your air horn fitting failed or your airbag blew, you would end up draining the pressure in this tank below the appropriate pressure to use for brakes. And at some point your emergency brakes or parking brakes will come on. And I will show you how that works here later. Now, when I say you have 2 or 3 tanks, if you have airbags, air suspension on your bus or your vehicle, you'll have a pressure protected tank somewhere. That may not be 3 separate tanks. They do make tanks where you've got 3 chambers in one and it's divided internally. This bus does have airbags. And when I talk about airbags, I'm not talking about like steering wheel or dash mounted safety airbags, but air suspension airbags, also called air springs. Now these are really nasty. This is not my bus. I picked this up for a customer, and these airbags definitely need to be replaced because they're going to fail at some point pretty soon. But the presence of air springs like this or airbags tells me that there is an auxiliary tank on this bus. And if I were to trace the air lines back from here through the leveling valve back up to a tank, where that connects to that tank will tell me that tank is pressure protected, and I could also tie an air horn into that safely. When this airbag fails, it's going to ride at an angle, maybe low if they both fail, but you'll still be able to drive the bus because the main primary and secondary brake pressures shouldn't drop below about 60 psi. I had that happen on the way back from Washington State in a transit bus, had an airbag that went out. The bus leaned and the air pressure was a little lower than normal. We weren't getting to 120, but made for a perfectly safe trip coming home. Still had braking and I wasn't worried about that. And back to me. So it's the next day, it's raining, typical Flagstaff area weather, sunny one day, raining or snowing the next. We might get snow, you don't ever know. Anyway, before I do all the assembly of this and do the little demo, I want to show you what I use for sealing joints. I don't use Teflon tape. I think that stuff's developed or was designed by some kind of sadist. I don't find that it seals really well. You got to wrap it the right way, and that's easy to learn, but it just doesn't work as well as something like this, which sets up just softly. It sets up kind of like a putty, does a really good job of sealing threads. It works on water, gas, I think pretty much everything. It's vibration resistant. This is True Blue by Rector Seal. If you're doing something with, that's really critical, this is pretty common in the aviation industry, Permatex, high performance thread sealant. But for everything I'm doing on buses, the True Blue works great. So let's get to the demo. Before I do the connections, let me show you the fittings that I've got here. There are 2 types. One is a push to connect, sometimes listed as a PTC for push to connect. And the other is a compression fitting. And the compression fitting has a little ferrule inside of it. Ferrule, not feral like a wild pig. So that slips over the tubing. First you have to not drop the cap. First you got to put that on the tubing, then put the ferrule on there. On soft tubing, there's also a little insert that goes inside that keeps it from collapsing. And if you assemble that and tighten it down then with a wrench, which I will not do, it collapses or compresses that ferrule around the outside of the tubing and locks it into place. On this push to connect, you just simply push it in until it gets past the O-ring, and that's it. To take apart a compression fitting, you have to unscrew it, and that ferrule will be compressed around the outside of the tubing and there forever. For the push to connect fittings, you push down on this little black thing while you simultaneously pull out on the tubing, and it releases it. When you are on the air brake side of the system, you are supposed to use DOT, Department of Transportation, approved fittings. On the protected side, through the auxiliary side of the system, I'm not aware of any requirement for that. If you know of a rule that requires that on the downhill side or downstream side of the pressure protection valve, then please put that in the comments and let me know. I don't want to mislead anybody. This is a front brake assembly. There's no parking brake function. It only has a single hose. It's a service brake only. And when air is pressurized through that hose, when you apply the brakes, it fills that chamber. There's a rubber diaphragm and a plate. It's attached to this rod here that pushes that rod out, which is attached to the slack adjuster. The slack adjuster in this case is an automatic one, but the slack adjuster rotates. It's attached to a shaft that goes over to the S-cam, and when that rotates the S-cam, it expands the brake pads against the inside of the drum over here. When you push the button to release your parking brakes in your air brake system, you're actually pressurizing the parking brake chamber, which overcomes the spring tension and lets the plunger return to its kind of neutral position. So we pressurize this, it releases or overcomes the spring tension back here, and the plunger then pulls back, the rod pulls back, releases the pressure on the S-cam, and you release the parking brakes. Then, while you're driving around, that side is pressurized, pulling the spring back, and when you step on the brakes, you're applying air pressure on this side. I'll show you how that works when we actually have it connected on this. Keep in mind, this is super important. On the modern buses, this ring that captures that spring in there it's fixed. It's clamped in place, and this ring goes all the way around and is pressed, and you can't take it apart unless you were to cut this. But on some of the older vintage buses, this ring has a clamp on it, and if you were to take that off, that spring in here is strong enough that it could be deadly. So don't ever try to disassemble one of these. New rear brake chambers typically come with a caging bolt just stored. It's just a bolt like that. This one's a little bit longer than mine. This is a spare that I carry whenever I go pick up a bus because these are not always present. But the caging bolt is typically stored in a little holder like that. And the caging bolt is used in the event you could not start your bus and you didn't have air pressure, which of course you need to release the parking brake if you had to roll the bus somewhere or get it towed. And so the caging bolt goes in the back and fits in a little recess. So you put it in there and turn it, and then with the nut and the washer, you pull that tight, it pulls the caging bolt out, compresses that spring, releases the parking brake, and if you do that on both sides of your rear axle, then you could at least roll the bus somewhere. Here is a rear parking brake chamber. It's got the parking brake spring. In the back here is where the caging bolt would go if I needed to release the parking brakes. And you'll notice that the caging bolt is missing from here, which is why when I travel to pick up a bus, I always take some with me. Now above these, you'll see the airlines, and it's pretty common to color code the primary or rear brakes green and the secondary orange, but that doesn't always hold because this orange line goes to the parking brake. At least that's my experience. If you know of some different kind of method for that, please put it in the comments, and you wouldn't go by that anyway. It would be a good hint that you don't want to tie into one of these because that would be a brake airline, but they can change these out with black. So the easiest way, like I said, is to find an airbag in the back. This truck has springs, so there is no air suspension, but there is an auxiliary tank because it's got an air seat and air controls for the power takeoff and stuff. But anyway, that tank I showed earlier might very well be a primary or rear brake air tank just because it had a green line coming into it, but maybe not. I am laying under a bus for you. So this bus actually has 5 air tanks, and these are the drain valves. So you want to make sure every day, every time you drive, some people say before your trip, some people say after the trip. There are conflicting sort of rationales for that, but you want to drain any any water and potentially oil residue that might be in these tanks. So there are 4 tanks. I don't know which is the auxiliary tank. I would have to trace those back like I talked about. This one also has this huge tank, that thing there, the BFT, because this has an air starter, so it takes that large volume of air to spin the starter to start the engine. But anyway, if I did identify that this was a pressure protected auxiliary tank, I could take one of these out and put in a T. If I'm going to add a fitting like this for an air chuck on the side, you want to make sure you use a steel nipple. I don't use brass. This looks like brass. It's kind of gold in color, but it is steel. But then I can put that in here. I would not put it down in the bottom for a couple of reasons. One, you're going to get a lot of water or anything in here. There is an extra port up here, and if you can find that and verify again that this is an auxiliary or pressure protected tank, then you could take that out, put in a bushing, put this in there, and Bob's your uncle. If your bus has an air ride seat, then it will almost always, in fact, I've never seen one that didn't have a 1/4-inch hard nylon line to it, and that line is on a pressure protected portion of the system, unless somebody just cobbled it together incorrectly. And this is a nice addition to a cab. It's a little blowgun. You can get this kit really at any truck stop. Love's, Pilot, TA, they all have them. They're about $25. It comes with the T, everything you need. You can install it in the parking lot of the truck stop. And it's just really handy then for blowing all the dirt out of your cab just off the floorboards. Handy thing, worth the $25, I think. What I have done is hooked this up the way you would do it wrong, just to show you what happens. So if this is my air tank and I just tapped into a line indiscriminately and it happened to be one of the brake system lines, that line runs down here to this, it's really a T, it's a Y, but anyway, from here to there is a continuous path. So when I pressurize this tank, air will flow through here, over here, release the parking brake, and everything is fine. And then I've got my air horn valve, which runs over to my air horn. All that works just fine unless you have a problem. So first let's pressurize the tank and see what happens with the parking brake. You'll see that the parking brake is retracted, or the rod. When I talk about the parking brake, I'm talking about the whole system. So again, this rod gets retracted, pulls back on the slack adjuster, rotates the shaft with the S-cam, and then the brake shoes and the brake pads can get pulled by the springs inside the brake assembly away from the drum. We're at about 50 or so PSI right now. So everything's fine. If I push on this button, I've got air horn. And that's the wrong way to do it, just because it's not safe. So while this works, it's not safe, because if there was a failure in that line to the air horn or to the airbags or to the seat or the blowgun or to my, auxiliary nozzle for airing up tires or anything that you added to the system incorrectly, if one of those points fails and you lose air pressure, I'll show you what happens. So if I pull this line out and then push that valve, you'll see how the parking brake gets released because of the drop in air pressure. And that parking brake will come on, like I said, whether you want it to or not. It might be an inconvenient time. So let's set that up differently. This is a pressure protection valve, and it's got arrows on it. So the pressurized part of the system, the compressor, would come in on this side. This side would go to your auxiliary tank or to any device that you added. And what this does is it prevents the pressure on the input side from dropping below whatever the setting is for this. This one might be 60 PSI. So if I have 100 PSI on this side and I blow the fitting on this side, the air pressure on this side will drop from 100 down to about 60 PSI, but it won't go any lower. So let me put one of these in the line and we'll do that again. Now I've set this up the safe way. I've got the tank pressurized to a little over 60 PSI. You'll see that the parking brake is retracted. I added the pressure protection valve. So we've got 60 PSI air going over here to the parking brake side, retracting the parking brake. On this side, then I've got the protected side, which would go to your device or a tank. You'll see that the horn still works. My brakes work. If I activate the service brake side, and if I pull this off, if I have a leak in that system, it moved a little bit, but the pressure is still at 60 PSI. The air volume and pressure coming out of here is diminishing because this pressure protection valve is keeping all of that from leaking out. And eventually this will stop altogether and my parking brake is still retracted. So anyway, air brake systems are super safe the way that it's designed, so that if you lose air pressure, the default is to stop you. Unlike the old single chamber systems on some of the vintage buses, where if you lose air pressure, the only way to stop is the Johnson bar handbrake on the driveline, and you can burn those out pretty easily. So it's a super safe system. My goal here was really twofold. One was to show you, especially a new user, new air brake owner and operator, how the air brakes work. But more importantly, how to add devices, air horns, other things without making your air brake system less safe. So be safe traveling out there. Thanks for your time today. As always, Have a great day.